I'm going to give it to them. In December 1962, Queen Elizabeth II watched a 222-minute version of Lawrence of Arabia. 3 weeks later, that version disappeared forever. Producer Sam Spiegel secretly cut 20 minutes to squeeze in extra showings. Each minute he removed made him $50,000 richer. For 27 years, audiences watched a butchered film without knowing it. The missing scenes didn't just change the story. They hid the real Lawrence, a man so brutal that test audiences walked out in horror. Today, we reveal what Hollywood buried for profit. In early 1960, the Lawrence of Arabia project almost collapsed before a single frame was shot. The first version of the script had been written by Michael Wilson, a blacklisted writer hired quietly by producer Sam Spiegel. But when director David Lean read Wilson's draft in Jordan, he walked out in protest. He said the script was impossible to shoot. His exit left a fully paid crew stranded in the desert, and Columbia Pictures threatened to pull its support unless a new version was written fast. In desperation, Spiegel turned to Robert Bolt, a respected playwright who had never written for film. Bolt agreed, but warned that he would need to rebuild the story from the ground up. Lean came back to London, and the two worked around the clock. By day, Bolt wrote. By night, he and Lean discussed every page over drinks and long conversations. The rewritten pages were then flown across the desert to the crew before each sunrise, a process they nicknamed camel mail. Within weeks, nearly all of Wilson's work was gone. By November 1962, Wilson admitted that less than 10% of his original dialogue had survived. What was once called the script that wouldn't cross the sand became the foundation of one of the greatest films ever made. But rewriting the script was just one crisis. The financial risk was another. The entire production cost about $15 million, the most expensive British film at that time. Columbia agreed to distribute it, but left the day-to-day spending to Spiegel, meaning he personally covered every overrun. In the middle of the Jordanian desert, Spiegel sat in a makeshift office under generator lights, signing dozens of payment slips each night. He hired over 1,000 Bedouin extras, 300 camels, and 150 horse handlers under his own name. Crew members started calling the project Spiegel's Folly, but the gamble paid off. The movie earned more than $46 million in worldwide rentals, clearing Spiegel's debt in just 15 months. Before any of this, David Lean had hit a wall. After the success of The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957, he spent 2 years trying to get a film about Gandhi off the ground, but nothing came of it. Lean later said the failure left him ready to quit filmmaking. Then Sam Spiegel called. He pitched Lean the idea of a film set in the desert, not just about Lawrence, but about the desert itself as a mirror of the man's mind. That concept reignited Lean's interest. He became obsessed with turning heat haze into a dramatic element. For one shot, the entrance of Sheriff Ali, he used a 482mm lens to compress the shimmering desert into a single distant figure. And it took 4 days to capture. Several camera motors were destroyed in the process. But when Lean saw the final image, he knew he had something special. That moment killed all talk of retirement. Behind the scenes, Columbia executives had their own doubts. While Lean and Bolt were rewriting, the studio worried that the film's slow pace and serious tone would fail in the American market. So, they quietly hired 2 uncredited writers to create an alternate version. Their script added a fictional American character, a love story, and a patriotic flag-waving finale. The rewrite was mailed to Jordan in September 1961. Lean read it, called it Hollywood tripe, and ripped it up in front of the entire crew. Bolt later said he never wrote a single line involving romance, and thanked Lean for keeping the desert pure. The gaffers jokingly labeled the discarded draft Operation Sabotage. The pages were forgotten until decades later when they were uncovered in Columbia's archives. Casting wasn't easy either. When Peter O'Toole's screen test landed in front of Columbia executives in February 1961, they dismissed him as a pretty boy without screen presence. David Lean exploded at the suggestion. The studio wanted Cary Grant, who was 57, but Lean insisted O'Toole was the right choice. He quietly ordered a second screen test, O'Toole yelling lines from 7 Pillars while firing a Webley revolver. That version reached Hollywood overnight, and the reply came quickly. The studio chief said, "The kid terrifies me. He stays." O'Toole was hired for $15,000, 1/12 of what Grant had demanded. Before O'Toole, there had been talks with Marlon Brando. In late 1960, Brando's agent asked for $1 million and 10% of the gross. At the time, it was an unheard-of sum. Brando had just become the first actor to earn $1 million for Mutiny on the Bounty and was now trying to double down. Spiegel refused. Brando called him a Hollywood parasite and mailed a postcard from Tahiti that read, "Too hot in the desert, try Fiji." And with that, the talks ended. The demand set a new record, but Brando never joined the film. On set, the tension didn't stop. Anthony Quinn arrived in Aqaba in July 1961 and discovered that his role as Auda Abu Tayi had been cut dramatically to make more space for Omar Sharif's character. Furious, Quinn told Lean he would leave unless his big monologue, the one about his 23 wounds, was restored. Lean compromised. Quinn got to keep his speech and gained a dramatic close-up, while Sharif kept the iconic entrance across the Mirage. Their feud lasted months. Crew members began calling their camel caravans the Quinometer because tempers flared every time a scene shifted focus away from Auda. Not all doubts were shouted. Alec Guinness, who played Prince Faisal, kept his worries quiet. Letters he wrote in 1962, only published decades later, reveal he was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of wearing brownface. He feared the makeup would make him look like a wax caricature. Still, he took the role for $100,000 and stayed silent in public. In private, he begged Lean to light him softly, to make him ghost-like rather than exaggerated. His concerns about representation came years before such conversations reached mainstream Hollywood. Claude Rains had just 2 weeks to prepare. On August 1, 1961, he was vacationing in New Hampshire when Robert Newton, the actor originally cast as Dryden, died of a heart attack. Rains was flown to Jordan immediately. He hadn't read the book, didn't know the script, and had only fragments of dialogue taped inside his tarbouche. He learned most of his lines while bouncing through the desert in a jeep, reading pages taped to the dashboard. 4 hours after arriving, he was in costume and in front of the camera. On December 10, 1962, something strange happened in London. Queen Elizabeth II arrived at the Odeon, Leicester Square for the royal premiere of Lawrence of Arabia. The version she watched that night ran for 222 minutes, nearly 4 hours. It was exactly what director David Lean had delivered. Nothing was cut. Nothing was trimmed. This was his full vision shown for the first time. But just a few weeks later, that version vanished. Producer Sam Spiegel quietly told Lean to shorten the film. 20 minutes were removed, bringing the runtime down to 202 minutes. Most people didn't even notice. Newspapers kept printing the original 222-minute length. And no one told the public that what they'd soon watch in theaters wasn't the same as the version the Queen had seen. Key scenes were gone, like Lawrence being humiliated in the officer's mess, and quiet conversations that revealed more about his inner world. Only 2 prints of the long version existed, and both disappeared into Columbia's archives. Audiences spent decades watching a version that had been trimmed behind the scenes. Even though the shortened version was what played worldwide, it still made a fortune. The movie grossed nearly $70 million against a $15 million budget. By trimming it down, theaters could squeeze in 1 extra showing per day. That small change boosted revenue by around 20% in every cinema. Everyone thought they were watching the full masterpiece, but what they saw had already been edited for profit. For 27 years, the original cut stayed hidden. People unknowingly paid to see a version that had lost important pieces, and the money kept pouring in. Critics praised it from the very start. They loved the music by Maurice Jarre, the stunning desert scenes captured by Freddie Young, and Peter O'Toole's unforgettable performance. Their reviews helped turn the film into a legend. But every single one of those reviews was written about the 202-minute version. None of the critics knew that the film had already lost 9 pages of dialogue. They were writing about a version David Lean later called crippled. The truth didn't come out until 1989, when the full version was finally restored. That's when scholars realized that what people had been calling a masterpiece for decades was never the complete story. The Oscars didn't catch it either. On April 10, 1963, at the 35th Academy Awards, Lawrence of Arabia won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. But Academy members only saw the shortened version. Columbia's press kit listed 202 minutes as the official runtime, so no one questioned it. When the full cut returned in 1989, historians finally understood the odd truth. The Academy had given its highest honor to a film that wasn't shown in its complete form. Lean never made a public scene about it, but when the longer version was restored, he approved it as the real one. One of the most haunting changes was right at the beginning. In Lean's original version, the movie didn't open with the roar of a motorcycle. It started quietly with a shot of Lawrence's broken goggles hanging from a tree near the road where he died on May 19, 1935. That image was meant to return later in the desert scenes, creating a visual loop that linked his death back to his journey. But when the film was shortened in 1962, the goggles shot was the very first thing they cut. It lasted only 16 seconds, but its absence broke the story's circle. Instead of a slow, ghostly moment that hinted at fate, the movie began with chaos. Just that one cut changed the tone completely. Lean had used that tiny image for something much bigger. The goggles weren't just a random prop. They were a sign of Lawrence's obsession with speed and danger. Without them, the crash just looks like a tragic accident. With them, the audience would have known from the beginning that he was racing toward death. Scholars who restored the film in 1988 found that Lean had spent 392 frames on that one shot, more than 16% of the entire crash sequence. It was meant to set the tone for the whole film. Cutting it erased a vital piece of psychological groundwork. When Lean found out about the missing shot, he was furious. He had spent years working as an editor before becoming a director, and he treated every frame like a brick in a perfect structure. When he learned that the goggles scene had been cut while he was still mixing the sound in December 1962, he sent a memo calling it artistic vandalism. He was so angry he didn't speak to Sam Spiegel for almost a year. They communicated only through assistants, even during the Oscar campaign. By then, Lean was already known for being obsessive. His camera operator called him a dedicated maniac. This betrayal just made him more guarded. When restoration began in 1988, the first thing he said was, "This time we keep the goggles, whatever it costs." That small scene was packed with meaning. Lean had built the whole film around symbols, and sun imagery played a huge role. Lawrence, pale and out of place, had cast himself as a kind of desert god. The goggles were a warning that his vision of himself was flawed, that he'd never really understand the desert or his own identity. Lean had carefully planned that shot with an empty sky in the background, linking the peaceful countryside to the brutal desert. The film's composer had even written a faint metallic jingle to match the goggles, which echoed later during a desert wind scene. But none of that made it into the version people saw. The symbolism was lost for 20 years. Editor Anne V. Coates, who won an Oscar for her work on the film, later said she regretted cutting that shot more than any other. In a 1996 interview, she admitted it still kept her up at night. Back in 1962, she'd been ordered to trim exactly 212 seconds so the film would fit better into London's schedules. The goggles shot was one of the last things to go, cut after 18 straight hours in the editing room because it didn't interfere with dialogue. Years later, she did the math and realized that removing that single image cost the movie nearly 30% of its visual callbacks. When she joined the 1988 restoration, her first task was to find those 384 missing frames. She located them in a British vault, unmarked in Reel 1A, and she personally glued them back in. In 1917, something happened to T.E. Lawrence in Deraa that he would never fully recover from. According to his own words in 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he was stripped, beaten, and raped by the Turkish governor. That's what he wrote on page 433 of his 1922 text. When the movie Lawrence of Arabia was made in 1962, the original script showed this scene just as brutally. But in the final cut, most of it was removed. All that remained was some groping, some violence, and a long, lingering stare. Even with the edits, viewers could feel what had happened. But by not showing the full horror, the movie lost something vital. Lawrence's later brutality, especially during the Tafas massacre, ended up looking like a sudden personality shift. The truth is, it wasn't sudden at all. It was the aftermath of trauma. In the original version, Jose Ferrer's performance as the Bey was terrifying. During the Dara scene, he compared Lawrence to a woman, called his men cattle, and delivered a line with a smirk. A man cannot always be uniform, while pulling at his torn clothes. But when the film was cut down from 222 minutes to 187 for a 1971 re-release, all those lines were removed. The result was silence, where menace used to be. That silence made the moment confusing instead of horrifying. Even the restored 1989 version couldn't bring those lines back because the sound reels had been destroyed. Behind the scenes, there was panic. Columbia Pictures wanted a shorter, faster version of the movie for its 1971 run. But the real pressure came from censorship boards. Both the British and American regulators were disturbed by the implications of the Dere scene. They didn't want anything that hinted too clearly at sexual assault, especially homosexual assault, between a white man and a Middle Eastern captor. Producer Sam Spiegel went further than required. He didn't just trim, he gutted the scene. 40 extra seconds were cut to make sure the film kept its market-friendly rating. But even after all that, critics still said the film felt watered down, and director David Lean refused to support that version. The edits didn't just hurt the story. They damaged Peter O'Toole's performance. In the full cut, right after the assault, O'Toole gave one of his most haunting moments, his eyes lowering, his breath hitching, a tiny wince as he buttoned his uniform. Every movement spoke of pain and humiliation. But in the shorter version, those seconds were gone. Lawrence went from being beaten to riding back into the desert, and the audience was left wondering why he suddenly seemed different. That confusion carried into the rest of the film. The later violence, especially Tafas, made no sense without seeing the damage done to him. Even O'Toole admitted in interviews that some of his best work was cut. It took until 1989 for those lost moments to return. That same 1989 restoration also revealed something else. The original Tafas massacre was even darker than people realized. The new footage showed long shots of bodies and a moment where Lawrence calmly shoots a surrendering soldier. But what's still missing are the scenes Lean filmed in Morocco, where Lawrence orders his men to kill wounded Turkish soldiers with knives to save bullets. These weren't emotional acts of revenge. They were cold, calculated executions, and they were filmed. Lawrence walked among the wounded and gave the orders himself. But the footage was so disturbing that Lean never used it, fearing audiences couldn't handle the truth. Lawrence's psychological unraveling went deeper than what made it to screen. One of the most chilling lines ever written for the character was cut entirely. After he executes Qasim, he was supposed to say, "I enjoyed it," but that wasn't the end. In another scene, Lawrence describes in detail the thrill he got from killing. The sound of the gun, the way a man's face changed as he died. O'Toole delivered these lines with icy calm, so calm that test audiences in 1962 started walking out of the theater. Spiegel deleted 8 full minutes of dialogue showing Lawrence's descent into bloodlust. What remained was just a shadow of the terrifying man he became. Without those scenes, Lawrence still looked broken, but not monstrous. The missing dialogue would have changed that completely. The movie also stripped away how deeply Lawrence's Arab allies were shaken by his transformation. Deleted scenes showed Ali confronting him after the executions, saying his violence was worse than anything he had once criticized the Arabs for. Ali, too, had a scene where he told Lawrence, "You've become what you accused me of being." Those scenes weren't small. They showed fear, real fear, growing in the people who once admired him, and they explained why. Later in the film, the Arab coalition starts to fall apart. Without those scenes, it looks like just another case of cultural miscommunication. But that wasn't the reason. The reason was Lawrence. And then there's the moral truth the film never fully showed. The real Lawrence violated the laws of war. Original footage captured him ordering the destruction of medical supplies and stopping Arab fighters from giving water to wounded Turks. These are war crimes. In Lean's notes to Spiegel, he openly questioned whether audiences could cheer for a man who, by modern standards, would be guilty under international law. He was right to worry. If those scenes had been included, Lawrence would no longer be a complicated hero. He'd be something much darker. Sam Spiegel didn't just trim a film. He took a knife to a masterpiece with the cold focus of a businessman chasing numbers. His logic was brutally simple. Every minute he cut from Lawrence of Arabia meant theaters could squeeze in one more showing a day. That translated to more tickets, more revenue, and an extra $50,000 for every single minute lost. When he slashed 20 minutes from the film just weeks after its December 1962 royal premiere, he made himself $1 million richer. And just like that, David Lean's 222-minute epic became a 202-minute product. The art was secondary. The goal was profit. Theater owners had complained 2 showings a day weren't enough. Spiegel gave them 3. But in doing so, he treated a towering work of cinema like a fast food item, cut for speed and turnover. For years, people believed Lean had been away when it happened, powerless to stop it. That's the story Spiegel told. That's what editor Ann Coates backed up in interviews. But later, she admitted her memory had been wrong. Lean had been right there in the editing room, watching, silent, powerless. Spiegel held the money. Lean held nothing. The man who had spent years crafting a sweeping desert odyssey was forced to watch as someone else dismantled it, scene by scene. And then came the final cruelty. Spiegel told the world it had all happened behind Lean's back, casting the director as a willing participant in the ruin of his own vision. Spiegel didn't stop at cutting the film. He made sure it could never be put back together. He scattered the removed footage across different storage vaults, storing it in pieces so that no one, not even Lean, could easily retrieve it. This wasn't sloppiness. It was a strategy. When restoration expert Robert A. Harris began hunting for the footage in 1986, he found himself tracing a cinematic breadcrumb trail through mislabeled reels and forgotten vaults. What should have been a single archive became a fragmented mess, hidden on purpose. The famous goggles shot and many other key moments were presumed lost simply because they were hidden too well. For 25 years, from 1963 to 1987, the world watched a version of Lawrence of Arabia that was no longer complete. The $600,000 restoration was only needed because Spiegel made sure the footage stayed buried. But it gets darker. There were whispers that Spiegel had committed insurance fraud. The lost footage wasn't really lost. It had been stored the whole time, just hidden. Yet reports claimed it was gone, possibly triggering insurance payouts for missing materials. If Spiegel claimed those losses while still possessing the footage, that's fraud. Serious fraud. And no one investigated. By the time the reels re-emerged, the statute of limitations had passed. The crime, if it happened, was safe from justice. That's the dirty secret hiding behind one of Hollywood's greatest epics. Columbia Pictures didn't just let this happen. They helped it. Studio executives feared that Lean's artistic pretensions might hurt the bottom line. They sided with Spiegel, not the director. Internally, they knew what was being done to the film, but publicly, they stood behind the lies. When Lean took home the Academy Award, he said nothing. Columbia had made it clear, speak out and your career ends. None of the cast spoke either. The silence wasn't agreement. It was fear. Columbia chose immediate profits over protecting a legacy. They knew they were destroying something irreplaceable, and they didn't care. Then came Robert A. Harris. In December 1986, he began what would become the most difficult film restoration ever attempted. For 2 months, he worked without pay, scouring Columbia's vaults, combing through 6,000 pounds of disorganized film, bits and fragments, mismatched labels, rotting reels. Then, in January 1987, something extraordinary happened. Hidden inside a trim can, Harris found the missing scenes. It was as if they'd never existed. He made a phone call in the middle of the night, almost crying with relief. He had found what no one thought could be found. But the work had only just begun. Much of the footage had no sound. Some was decayed. The fragments had to be stitched back together, frame by frame, piece by piece. Some of those pieces had been labeled as outtakes. Others weren't labeled at all. Harris had to reconstruct entire sequences. And even then, some scenes had to be dubbed again. At the start of Act 2, for instance, a 30-second segment required Peter O'Toole and Alec Guinness to return and re-record lines they hadn't spoken in over 2 decades. It was a race against time and against deterioration. David Lean, now 80, returned to finish what had been stolen from him. For 2 weeks in 1988, he worked alongside Harris to recut the entire film. This was more than editing. It was reclaiming something sacred. Lean finally had the chance to present his masterpiece the way he'd intended back in 1962. He approved every frame, adjusted every sound, and even helped restore the color and timing. The result was a 216-minute cut, still not the original 222, but closer than the world had seen in over 2 decades. The technology used for the restoration didn't exist when the film was first made. Matching 26-year-old footage with new prints required digital techniques that were still cutting edge in the late 1980s. Some reels were missing sound entirely. Others had degraded visuals. Harris and his team had to rebuild scenes using whatever scraps they could find, spending not just $600,000 for the restoration, but another $2 million for new prints and promotion. The restored film featured 70mm prints with 6-track stereo sound, replicating the grandeur of the original roadshow screenings. Then in 2012, Sony restored the film again for its 50th anniversary, using digital tools far more powerful than Harris had in 1988. One name helped push this resurrection into the spotlight: Steven Spielberg. As co-chair of the AFI's Preservation Center, Spielberg stepped in as a powerful advocate. He had first seen Lawrence of Arabia in Phoenix as a teenager and said it was the film that made him want to become a director. He helped arrange fundraising premieres in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles in February 1989. All proceeds went to preservation efforts. Spielberg's influence ensured Columbia cooperated, and his endorsement gave the restoration the legitimacy it needed to succeed.